Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the person staring back at you in the mirror is a complete stranger. Not physically, every feature remains familiar. But something far more unsettling has occurred. The essence, the core of who you believed yourself to be, has suddenly become foreign, alien, unrecognizable. You reach for your usual morning routine, but your hands hesitate. These actions, these habits, these automatic responses that have defined your days, do they actually belong to you, or have you been unconsciously performing someone else's life? This isn't science fiction. This is the most terrifying realization that can dawn upon a human consciousness. The possibility that everything you've identified as yourself might be nothing more than a carefully constructed performance, assembled from fragments of expectations, inherited beliefs and social conditioning. The person you think you are, with your preferences, your values, your dreams, your fears, might be the most elaborate fiction you've ever created. Consider this. How many of your opinions did you actually form through genuine contemplation, and how many did you absorb unconsciously from your environment? When you express a political view, choose a career path, or even decide what music you enjoy, are these choices emerging from your authentic core, or are they echoes of voices that have been whispering in your ear since childhood? Parents, teachers, peers, media, society, until their words became indistinguishable from your own thoughts. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung spent decades exploring this very phenomenon. He discovered that most people live their entire lives wearing what he called personas, masks we unconsciously adopt to fit into the world around us. But here's where it becomes truly disturbing. These masks don't just hide our true selves, they often replace them entirely. We become so identified with our roles, our social identities, our professional titles, that we lose all connection to whoever we might have been underneath. You might be a successful lawyer, but strip away the title, the social status, the external validation. Who remains? You might be a devoted parent, but remove the role, the responsibilities, the identity that parenthood provides. What's left? You might pride yourself on being logical, emotional, creative, practical. But what if these traits aren't naturally yours? What if they're simply the personality you constructed to survive in your particular environment? Here's the question that should keep you awake at night. If you removed every opinion you inherited, every behavior you learned to gain acceptance, every aspect of yourself that exists to fulfill others' expectations, would there be anything left? Or would you discover that the person you've been calling yourself was nothing more than a collection of borrowed parts, assembled to create the illusion of a coherent identity? This isn't just philosophical speculation. Modern neuroscience reveals that our sense of self is far more fragmented and constructed than we'd like to believe. The story you tell yourself about who you are, your narrative identity, is largely fiction, constantly being rewritten by your brain to maintain the illusion of continuity. You're not the same person you were 10 years ago or even yesterday, yet you maintain the comfortable delusion that there's some essential you that has remained constant throughout your life. But what if there isn't? What if the question, who are you really, has no answer because there's no stable, unchanging self to discover? What if your entire quest for authenticity is based on the false premise that somewhere, buried beneath all the conditioning and performance, there's a real you waiting to be found? The implications are staggering. If you don't actually know who you are, if your entire sense of identity is constructed rather than discovered, then every decision you've made, every relationship you've formed, every path you've chosen might have been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of your own nature. You might have been living someone else's life without ever realizing it. This realization should terrify you, but it should also liberate you, because if your identity is constructed rather than fixed, if your sense of self is malleable rather than predetermined, then you have far more power than you've ever imagined. You're not trapped by who you've been. You're free to become who you choose to be. But first, you need to see through the illusion. You need to recognize the persona for what it is. You need to question everything you've assumed about yourself, and you need to ask the most dangerous question of all. Who are you really? If this question unsettles you, if it makes you want to Look deeper into the mirror of your own consciousness. Then subscribe to this channel and hit that like button, because we're about to embark on a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about yourself. We're going to strip away the layers of conditioning, the masks of social identity, and the stories you've been telling yourself about who you are. And what we discover might shock you to your core. The reason you don't know who you really are isn't a personal failing. It's the inevitable result of a psychological mechanism that begins operating from the moment you're born. What Jung called the persona isn't just a mask you occasionally wear. It's a survival system so sophisticated that it eventually hijacks your entire sense of identity. From your earliest moments of consciousness, you learned that certain behaviors earned approval while others brought rejection. Your developing psyche, desperate for safety and belonging, began cataloging these responses with obsessive precision. Smile and adults coo with delight, cry too much and faces turn away, express anger and love withdraws, show vulnerability and protection disappears. Your unconscious mind absorbed these lessons and began constructing a personality designed not for authenticity, but for survival. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this dynamic when he wrote about the herd mentality, the unconscious drive to conform that shapes human behavior. But Nietzsche's insight goes deeper than mere social conformity. He recognized that we don't just adapt our behavior to fit in, we adapt our very sense of self. We become what others need us to be, and eventually we forget we were ever anything else. This process operates through what psychologists call introjection, the unconscious absorption of external values, beliefs, and expectations until they feel like our own. Your parents' unspoken anxieties become your phobias. Your culture's definitions of success become your ambitions. Your peer group's emotional patterns become your relationship style. Layer by layer, year by year, you construct an identity from borrowed materials, believing all the while that you're discovering who you really are. But here's where the problem becomes truly insidious. This process doesn't just obscure your authentic self, it actively prevents you from developing one. Every time your natural impulses conflict with your constructed persona, you experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. Rather than exploring these conflicts as clues to your deeper nature, you unconsciously suppress them to maintain psychological coherence. The parts of yourself that don't fit your self-concept get pushed into what Jung called the shadow, the repository of all the aspects of yourself you've learned to reject. Arthur Schopenhauer recognized this dynamic. In his exploration of the will to live, the unconscious drive that operates beneath our conscious choices, Schopenhauer understood that what we call our personality is largely the result of unconscious forces beyond our awareness. We think we're making conscious decisions about who to be, but we're actually being shaped by psychological currents we can't even perceive. The French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre took this understanding even further. He argued that human consciousness is fundamentally nothingness, that we have no fixed essence or predetermined nature. This might sound liberating, but Sartre recognized it as terrifying. Faced with this existential void, most people flee into what he called bad faith, the desperate attempt to convince themselves that their constructed identity is real, fixed, and unchangeable. This psychological sleight of hand serves a crucial function. It protects you from the overwhelming anxiety of recognizing your fundamental freedom. As long as you believe you are a certain type of person with fixed traits and limitations, you don't have to confront the terrifying responsibility of choosing who to become. Your persona becomes a prison that feels like protection. But the cost is enormous. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and pioneering psychologist, observed that the primary source of human suffering isn't external circumstances. It's the loss of meaning that occurs when we become disconnected from our authentic selves. When you live according to others' expectations rather than your own values, when you pursue goals that feel empty because they aren't truly yours, when you relate to others through masks rather than genuine connection, you experience what Frankl called existential vacuum, a profound sense of emptiness that no external achievement can fill. Modern neuroscience has revealed the biological basis of this psychological trap. Your brain's default mode network, the neural system responsible for self-referential thinking, is constantly constructing and maintaining your sense of identity. But this system is heavily influenced by social feedback and environmental conditioning. The self your brain creates isn't a discovery of who you are, it's a prediction of who you need to be to survive and thrive in your environment. This explains why identity crises often occur during major life transitions. When your external circumstances change, when you graduate, change careers, end relationships, or face mortality, your brain's predictive model of who you are becomes unstable. The persona that served you in one context fails in another, and suddenly you're confronted with the question you've been unconsciously avoiding: who are you really? The tragedy is that most people respond to these crises by simply constructing a new persona, never recognizing the opportunity to discover something more authentic underneath. They trade one mask for another, one set of borrowed identities for a different set, never suspecting that the real question isn't which mask to wear, but whether they need to wear a mask at all. This is why the question, "Who are you really?" feels so threatening. It's not just asking you to examine your beliefs or preferences, it's asking you to question the entire foundation of your psychological existence. It's asking you to consider the possibility that everything you've identified as yourself might be nothing more than a sophisticated defense mechanism designed to help you navigate a world that punishes authenticity and rewards performance. The deeper you look, the more disturbing the picture becomes. But this disturbance is necessary, because only by recognizing the artificial nature of your constructed identity can you begin to glimpse what might lie beneath it. The most insidious aspect of living through a false identity isn't that you don't know who you are, it's that you don't even realize you're living a lie. The consequences of this psychological deception ripple through every aspect of your existence, creating patterns of suffering that feel inevitable but are actually entirely avoidable. Consider your relationships. When you interact with others through a persona, you're not actually connecting with them. You're connecting personas to personas, masks to masks. The intimacy you think you're experiencing is largely theatrical. Your partner falls in love with your performance, not your authentic self. Your friends appreciate the version of you that makes them comfortable, not the version that might challenge or surprise them. Even your family relationships become elaborate dances of mutual deception, where everyone plays their assigned roles to maintain the illusion of harmony. This creates what psychologists call relational authenticity deficit. You find yourself surrounded by people yet feeling profoundly alone. You have conversations that never touch anything real. You receive love and validation, but it feels hollow, because you know, on some unconscious level, that it's directed toward a character you're playing rather than who you actually are. The desperate hunger for genuine connection that haunts modern relationships isn't solved by finding the right person. It's solved by becoming a real person yourself. But the consequences extend far beyond relationships. When you don't know who you are, you can't know what you actually want. Your goals become borrowed ambitions. Your dreams reflect others' definitions of success. You pursue achievements that feel empty the moment you attain them, because they were never truly yours to begin with. This is why so many people experience what researchers call arrival fallacy, the devastating realization that reaching their goals doesn't provide the satisfaction they expected. The modern epidemic of anxiety and depression isn't primarily caused by external circumstances. It's caused by the exhausting effort of maintaining a false identity. Your unconscious mind knows something is wrong, even if your conscious mind hasn't figured it out yet. You experience a persistent sense of unease, a feeling that you're living the wrong life, but you can't identify the source because the problem isn't what you're doing, it's who you're pretending to be while you're doing it. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's research reveals that our sense of self is intimately connected to our emotional processing systems. When you're disconnected from your authentic identity, you're also disconnected from your genuine emotional responses. You might feel what you think you should feel rather than what you actually feel. You might suppress emotions that don't fit your persona or amplify emotions that do. Over time, This emotional inauthenticity creates a kind of psychological static that interferes with your ability to make good decisions. The decision-making process becomes corrupted when filtered through a false identity. You choose based on what maintains your persona, rather than what serves your genuine interests. You avoid opportunities that might reveal aspects of yourself you've learned to hide. You pursue paths that reinforce your constructed identity, even when they lead nowhere meaningful. Your entire life becomes a kind of method-acting performance where you've forgotten you're playing a role. This explains the phenomenon of identity foreclosure, the premature commitment to an identity without exploring alternatives. Many people choose careers, relationships, and lifestyles not because these choices reflect their authentic selves, but because they fit the story they've been telling themselves about who they are. They become trapped in lives that feel increasingly restrictive because they're based on assumptions about themselves that were never actually tested. The cognitive load of maintaining a false identity is enormous. Your brain expends tremendous energy monitoring your behavior to ensure it remains consistent with your persona. This constant self-surveillance creates what psychologists call ego depletion, a state of mental exhaustion that impairs your ability to make good choices and resist impulses. You become reactive rather than responsive, driven by unconscious patterns rather than conscious intention. Perhaps most tragically, living through a false identity prevents you from accessing your genuine capabilities. Your authentic talents, insights, and perspectives remain buried beneath layers of conditioning. You might spend your entire life convinced you're not creative, not intelligent, not capable of leadership, not worthy of love. Not because these limitations are real, but because they're part of the identity you constructed to survive in your particular environment. The shadow, Jung's term for the repressed aspects of personality, grows more powerful the more you identify with your persona. All the qualities, impulses, and potentials you've rejected to maintain your constructed identity don't disappear. They accumulate in your unconscious, creating internal conflicts that manifest as self-sabotage, projection, and compulsive behaviors. You find yourself attracted to people who embody the qualities you've disowned, or you become irrationally triggered by behaviors that remind you of aspects of yourself you've learned to hate. This psychological fragmentation creates what trauma therapists call parts work, the recognition that we contain multiple, often conflicting aspects of personality. But instead of integrating these parts into a coherent whole, most people spend their lives in internal warfare, with their persona fighting to suppress anything that threatens its dominance. The ultimate consequence is a life of quiet desperation, not because your circumstances are particularly difficult, but because you're living as a stranger to yourself. You're haunted by a persistent sense that something essential is missing, that you're not living up to your potential, that there's a more authentic version of yourself waiting to emerge if you could just figure out how to access it. But recognition of the problem is the first step toward freedom. The prison of false identity only has power as long as you don't recognize it as a prison. The moment you truly understand that your identity is constructed rather than discovered, everything changes. This isn't just an intellectual realization, it's a psychological revolution that fundamentally alters your relationship with yourself and the world. But liberation from false identity doesn't happen through positive thinking or surface-level changes. It requires a radical dismantling of everything you've assumed about who you are. The first step is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming conscious of your unconscious patterns and reclaiming the parts of yourself you've rejected. This begins with shadow work, the courageous exploration of everything you've learned to disown about yourself. Every quality you judge harshly in others, every impulse you automatically suppress, every aspect of personality you consider not you. These are clues to the authentic self you've buried beneath your persona. But shadow work isn't about indulging every rejected impulse. It's about understanding why certain aspects of yourself became unacceptable in the first place. When you explore your shadow with curiosity rather than judgment, you often discover that the qualities you've rejected aren't inherently negative. They're simply inconvenient. For the identity you constructed to survive in your particular environment, Consider the person who identifies as always nice and shadows their capacity for healthy anger. Their niceness isn't authentic kindness. It's a survival strategy developed to avoid conflict and maintain approval. When they reclaim their capacity for anger, they don't become aggressive or cruel. They become capable of setting boundaries, standing up for their values, and protecting what matters to them. Their kindness becomes authentic because it's chosen rather than compulsive. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard understood this process when he wrote about the leap of faith, not religious faith, but the courage to embrace uncertainty and become who you're meant to be rather than who you think you should be. Kierkegaard recognized that authentic existence requires what he called the courage to be yourself, even when that self doesn't match others' expectations or your own preconceptions. This courage manifests in practical ways. It means paying attention to the moments when you feel most alive, most energized, most genuinely yourself, even if these moments don't fit your constructed identity. It means following your genuine curiosity rather than your inherited interests. It means expressing your actual opinions rather than the opinions you think you should have. It means making choices based on your authentic values rather than external expectations. But here's the revolutionary insight. You don't find your authentic self by looking inward for some hidden essence. You create your authentic self by taking authentic action. Your real identity emerges not through introspection, but through experimentation. Every time you act from genuine impulse rather than constructed persona, you strengthen the neural pathways of authenticity. Every time you choose courage over comfort, truth over approval, you literally rewire your brain to support your emerging authentic self. The process requires what existentialists call authentic anxiety, the uncomfortable feeling that arises when you step outside the familiar boundaries of your constructed identity. This anxiety isn't a sign that something is wrong, it's a sign that something is finally right. You're supposed to feel uncertain when you stop pretending to be someone you're not. Uncertainty is the price of freedom. Historical examples illuminate this process. Gandhi didn't discover his authentic self through meditation alone. He discovered it through courageous action that aligned with his deepest values, even when that action contradicted his trained identity as a proper British-educated lawyer. Rosa Parks didn't find her authentic self through self-help books. She found it in a moment of authentic refusal that emerged from her genuine exhaustion with injustice, not from any predetermined plan. These weren't people who had it all figured out. They were people who learned to trust their authentic impulses more than their social conditioning. They discovered that authentic action creates authentic identity, not the other way around. The rebellion against false identity also requires recognizing the difference between your thoughts and your thinking. Your persona generates automatic thoughts designed to maintain your constructed identity. Thoughts about what you should want, how you should feel, who you should be. But these thoughts aren't you. They're psychological software installed by your environment. When you learn to observe these thoughts without identifying with them, you create space for something more authentic to emerge. This is where meditation and mindfulness practices become powerful, not as methods for finding your true self, but as techniques for loosening your identification with your conditioned thoughts and reactions. When you can observe your mental patterns without being controlled by them, you gain the freedom to choose responses that align with your emerging authenticity rather than your historical conditioning. The most radical aspect of this rebellion is the recognition that authenticity isn't a destination, it's a practice. You don't become authentic once and then stay that way. You choose authenticity moment by moment, decision by decision, relationship by relationship. Each choice either strengthens your connection to your genuine self or reinforces your attachment to your constructed persona. This ongoing practice requires developing what psychologists call psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt your behavior to your authentic values rather than your inherited patterns. It means being willing to disappoint people whose love was contingent on your performance. It means risking the security of known identities for the uncertainty of authentic becoming. It means choosing growth over comfort, truth over convenience, authenticity over approval. The rebellion isn't just personal, it's revolutionary. When you stop living according to others' expectations, you give others permission to do the same. When you express your authentic thoughts and feelings, you create space for genuine connection. When you pursue your authentic interests and values, you contribute something unique to the world that could never have emerged from a constructed persona. But perhaps most importantly, you discover that the question, "Who are you really?" has been the wrong question all along. Here's the ultimate revelation that will shatter everything you thought you understood about identity, authenticity, and the human condition. There is no real you to discover. There never was. The entire quest to find your true self has been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what consciousness actually is. This isn't nihilistic. It's the most liberating truth you'll ever encounter. The reason you've struggled to answer, "Who are you really?" isn't because you haven't looked deep enough or tried hard enough. It's because the question assumes something that doesn't exist, a fixed, essential self waiting to be uncovered like buried treasure. What you actually are is far more magnificent and terrifying than any static identity could ever be. You are pure creative potential. You are consciousness itself, temporarily organized into patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior, but fundamentally free to reorganize itself in infinite ways. The Buddhist concept of anatman, or no self, points to this truth. What you call yourself isn't a thing at all. It's a process, a dynamic flow of awareness that's constantly creating and recreating itself. This realization explains why every attempt to nail down your true identity has felt frustrating and incomplete. You weren't failing to find yourself. You were trying to capture a river with your bare hands. The self you're looking for doesn't exist because consciousness is verb, not a noun. You don't have a self. You are selfing, moment by moment, choice by choice, breath by breath. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus understood this when he said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice." But he could have gone further. You're not just stepping in a different river each time, you're a different person each time. The you reading this sentence is not the same you who began reading this video. Consciousness is in constant flux, and the story of a continuous self is just that, a story your brain tells to create the illusion of coherence. But if there's no essential self to discover, what have all those moments of feeling authentic been about? They weren't moments when you found your true self. They were moments when you stopped pretending there was a fixed self to maintain. They were moments of pure presence, when the constructed identity dissolved and you experienced what the mystics call being rather than becoming. These weren't glimpses of who you really are. They were tastes of what it feels like to exist, without the burden of being someone in particular. This understanding transforms everything. The anxiety about finding yourself disappears because there's nothing to find. The pressure to be consistent with your past self dissolves because consistency was never required. The fear of change becomes excitement about possibility because you realize that change isn't something that happens to you. Change is what you are. Your personas weren't covering up your authentic self. They were authentic expressions of your creative capacity. Every role you've played, every identity you've constructed, every version of yourself you've experimented with has been a genuine creation of consciousness exploring its own possibilities. None of them were false. They were all real experiments in being human. The tragedy wasn't that you wore masks. It was that you forgot you were the one creating them. You became so identified with your creations that you lost touch with your creative power. You thought you were trapped in an identity when you were actually the artist painting it. This recognition returns you to your fundamental freedom. If there's no essential self to betray, then every choice becomes an act of self-creation rather than self-discovery. If consciousness is inherently fluid, then you can reorganize yourself around any values, pursue any interests, express any aspects of human potential that resonate with your current understanding of what it means to be alive. But this freedom comes with profound responsibility. If you're creating yourself moment by moment, then you're entirely responsible for the creation. You can't blame your past, your genetics, your circumstances, or your conditioning for who you are. Because who you are is who you're choosing to be right now, in this moment, with this decision. The question shifts from who am I really to who am I choosing to become? This isn't a question you answer once, it's a question you live every day. Every interaction, every choice, every response to circumstances is an opportunity to create yourself anew. You're not discovering your purpose, you're creating it. You're not finding your path, you're walking it into existence. This is why authentic living feels so alive and vital. It's not because you're finally being your true self. It's because you're consciously participating in the ongoing creation of yourself. You're moving from unconscious self-creation to conscious self-creation, from accidental identity to intentional becoming. The deepest intimacy becomes possible when you meet others from this understanding. Instead of persona meeting persona, you have consciousness meeting consciousness, creative potential meeting creative potential. Love becomes not about finding someone who accepts your fixed identity, but about finding someone who celebrates your endless capacity for becoming. Who are you really? You're the question asking itself. Your awareness aware of itself. You're the universe experiencing itself subjectively through the temporary organization of matter and energy you call your life. You're not a noun, you're a verb. You're not a thing, you're a happening. And in this very moment, you're creating yourself again. The most profound question isn't who are you really? It's who are you becoming? And the answer is entirely up to you. What version of yourself will you create next? What aspects of human potential will you explore? What new ways of being will you experiment with? The canvas is blank, the brush is in your hand, and the masterpiece of your existence is still being painted. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What does this realization mean for how you'll approach your life? And if this exploration of consciousness and identity has opened new possibilities for you, share this video with someone who might need to remember their own creative power. The revolution of authentic becoming isn't just personal, it's collective. When you remember who you really are, you give others permission to remember too.